You wake in complete darkness. The air is so thick you can taste it. Copal incense burning slow, sweet and bitter at once, curling into your lungs. But there's something else. Something warmer. Copper. Salt. The smell of living things open to the sky. You don't know where you are. Not yet. Your feet press against cold stone. Somewhere above you, drums beat in a rhythm that feels older than memory. Voices rise and fall like waves, chanting words you don't understand, but your body does. It tightens. It trembles. You are standing at the base of something immense. You can't see it, but you feel its weight pressing down on the night itself. This is Tenochtitlan. The year is 1487, and you are at the foot of the Templo Mayor. Above you, on those blood-darkened steps, something is happening. The Spanish chroniclers who would arrive decades later, men in black robes clutching crosses like shields, would call it unspeakable. They would write the word and then cross it out. They would look away, and in looking away, they would decide what history remembered. But to the Mexica people standing beside you in the dark, this is not horror. This is communion. This is the world renewing itself through flesh, through blood, through the act of bodies surrendering to something greater than survival. Sexuality here is not sin. It is sacred cosmic energy, the force that keeps the sun rising, the earth fertile, the universe from collapsing into silence. You were taught that these people were primitive, savage, lost in darkness. But what if the darkness was written by conquerors? What if everything you know about their sexuality, about shame, about sin, about the body itself, is a lie? The question pulls you forward, toward the temple, toward the truth they tried to bury. You cannot understand what happened in those temples until you understand the terror that built them. The Mexica believed they were living in the fifth sun, the fifth attempt at creation. 4 worlds had come before this one. 4 worlds had ended in fire, in flood, in the sky collapsing like a tent cut loose from its ropes. And this world, this fragile, blood-soaked present, was not guaranteed to survive. The gods were hungry, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The gods required feeding, or the sun would stop rising. The earth would crack open. The stars would fall like dead birds from the sky, and everything, every child, every harvest, every heartbeat, would vanish into the void that predates existence. This was not belief. This was knowledge. And so the Mexica gave them what they needed: tonalli, divine life force, the energy that animates flesh, that pulses in blood, that surges in the moment of sexual union. Blood was tonalli in its most concentrated form, warm, red, undeniable. But sexual energy was tonalli too. The same force that made the gods create the world in the first place. The same power that split the cosmic serpent in two and formed earth and sky from her broken body. In the Codex Borgia, you can still see it. Gods locked in sexual embrace, their bodies twisted into glyphs of creation. This wasn't pleasure. This wasn't lust. This was cosmology. The act of bodies joining was the act of the universe holding itself together. The Florentine Codex records it plainly. The priests understood that fertility and sacrifice were not opposites. They were twins. Both required the body to open. Both required surrender. Both transformed one thing into another: seed into life, blood into sunlight, flesh into time itself. To the Spanish friars who would later arrive with their ink and their horror, this was madness, perversion, the devil's work. But to the Mexica, it was the only thing keeping the world from ending. And in the temples, in the dark, the rituals continued, not in defiance of the gods' hunger, but in service to it. Her name was Tlazolteotl, the eater of filth. She had 2 faces, and both were true. She was the goddess of sexual pleasure, of the heat that rises between bodies in the dark, of desire that makes you forget your own name. But she was also the devourer of sin, the one who consumed transgression, who ate the shame and guilt of those who had strayed, and in eating it, purified them. To the Spanish mind, this was impossible, a contradiction. How could the same deity preside over lust and forgiveness? How could the act that damned you also be the act that saved you? But the Mexica understood what the friars could not. that desire and purification were not enemies. They were the same force, moving in opposite directions, like fire that both destroys and transforms, like blood that both ends life and begins it. In the temples dedicated to Tlazolteotl, confession was sacred. You would kneel before a priest and speak your sexual transgressions aloud. Every forbidden touch, every moment of weakness, every act that had pulled you from the path of balance. The priest would listen. He would not condemn. He would invoke Tlazolteotl's name, and she would descend and consume your sin like bread. You would leave clean. Bernardino de Sahagun, the Franciscan friar who spent decades documenting Mexica culture, recorded these rituals in the Florentine Codex with a scholar's precision and a Christian's horror. He describes ceremonies where sexual acts were performed as offerings, not for pleasure, not for lust, but to restore cosmic balance after moral violations. Bodies given to the goddess so the world could breathe again. Sahagun was disgusted. He called it demonic. But even through his revulsion, you can see the truth. The Aztecs had understood something centuries before Freud ever whispered it in Vienna. That sexuality was not one thing. It was dual, creative and destructive, sacred and profane, a force that could ruin you or renew you, depending on how it was offered. And in the highest rituals, in the ceremonies that took place at the temple's peak where the air was thin and the gods were close, sexuality and sacrifice became indistinguishable. The body opened. The gods fed. The world continued. But what happened on those steps, what the Spanish would witness and then spend centuries trying to erase, was something darker still. There's a festival the Spanish could barely write about without their hands shaking. Tlacaxipehualiztli, the flaying of men. It was held in honor of Xipe Totec, the flayed lord, the god of spring and renewal, the one who taught that new life only comes when the old skin is peeled away. And for 20 days each year, the priests made his truth visible. They would take captives, warriors from enemy cities, men who had fought and lost. They would lead them up the temple steps, and there, beneath the open sky, they would offer their hearts to the sun. The blood would pour, the drums would thunder, and then the priests would do something the chroniclers called unspeakable. They would skin the bodies, carefully, completely, the flesh peeled away like cloth, still warm, still wet with life. And then the priests would wear those skins. For 20 days, they would dance in the plazas wearing the faces of the dead, their arms hanging loose, their legs dragging, the skin growing tight and yellow as it dried against their own. The Primeros Memorials records this with cold precision. But what it doesn't say, what the Spanish friars erased or couldn't bear to name, is what the Nahuatl sources whisper, that these dances were not merely symbolic, that the priests, wearing the skins of the dead, engaged in acts of ritual sexuality, that the transformation was total, that to become another person, to wear their flesh and inhabit their form, was to cross the most sacred boundary, the boundary between self and other, between death and rebirth. Scholars like Inga Clendenin and David Carrasco have debated this for decades. The evidence is contested, fragmented, translated through layers of Christian horror. But the logic is there, embedded in the cosmology itself. If blood renews the sun, if sacrifice feeds the gods, then sexuality, the act of creation, of merging, of one becoming two, must also have been part of that renewal. Imagine believing so deeply in cosmic regeneration that you would wear a dead man's skin, that you would dance in his face, that you would perform acts of creation inside his flesh, so the earth would bloom again. This wasn't madness. This was faith. Faith so absolute it dissolved the self entirely. And the priests weren't the only ones asked to surrender. There were others, young men and women chosen long before the festival, chosen to live as gods. The ixiptla, the god impersonators. For an entire year, they would walk among the people as living divinity. They would be fed the finest foods, dressed in sacred garments, worshipped, and then, at the year's end, they would climb the temple steps and offer what the gods required. But that year of divine life before death, what did it include? Once a year, they chose the most beautiful young man in all of Tenochtitlan, not for his strength, not for his lineage, For his beauty, his grace, the way he moved through the world like light through water. They would bring him to the temple, and there, in front of the gathered crowd, they would tell him the truth. You are no longer yourself. You are Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, the god of night and destiny and sorcery. For 1 year, you will walk among us as divinity made flesh. And he was. For 365 days, he lived as no human ever could. He was fed rare delicacies, roasted quail, hunted cacao, fruits that grew only in the mountains. He was dressed in feathers and jade and gold. When he walked through the streets, people fell to their knees. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. Children reached out to touch his hem. The sick begged for his blessing. He was worshipped. In the final month, they gave him 4 wives. Young women chosen to represent the goddesses themselves. Fertility, water, maize, flowers. They weren't symbolic. They were his companions, his lovers. The intimate acts they shared weren't private. They were sacred theater. The god's desire made visible. The union of divine and human, played out in flesh. The Florentine Codex records this without shame, because to the Mexica, there was no shame in it. The ixiptla wasn't pretending to be a god. He was a god. His body had become a vessel. Every breath he took, every touch, every moment of pleasure or pain, all of it was divine. And he knew, from the very first day, he knew how it would end. At the year's close, he would walk up the temple steps alone. The wives would remain below, weeping. The crowd would watch in silence. And at the top, he would lie down on the stone, and the priest would open his chest, and his heart, Tezcatlipoca's heart, would be lifted to the sun. The Spanish called this barbarism. Mode dressed as ceremony. But the chronicles also record something they couldn't explain. Many went willingly. Joyfully, even. Accounts describe young men who smiled as they climbed. Who sang. Who seemed to understand something the conquistadors never could. That the body was not a prison. That flesh was not separate from spirit. That to dissolve into the divine, to become eternal through surrender, this was not loss. This was transcendence. We've lost that, haven't we? The ability to see the body as a site of the sacred. We've inherited the conqueror's shame, their horror, the need to split the world into pure and profane. But what if they were wrong? In the Kamikak, the school where priests and nobles were forged, young men learned that their bodies were not their own. They were instruments, tools of cosmic maintenance. Every night, in the dark before dawn, the priests would gather. They would take thorns from the maguey plant, long and sharp as needles, or obsidian blades, edges so fine they could split a hair, and they would pierce themselves. Tongues first. The thorn pushed through the soft flesh until it emerged on the other side, blood pooling warm and thick in their mouths. Then earlobes, then thighs, and then the genitals. The penis was not profane. It was sacred, a source of tonalli, life force, second only to the heart itself. To draw blood from it was to offer the gods the very essence of creation, not through the act of intercourse, but through the act of opening, of giving what could not be taken back. Diego Duran, the Dominican friar who chronicled Aztec practices with equal parts fascination and revulsion, recorded these rituals in detail. He described priests whose tongues were so scarred they could barely speak, whose genitals bore the marks of 1,000 piercings. Archaeological evidence confirms it. Ceremonial bloodletting tools have been found in temple caches, some still stained after 5 centuries in the earth. The Spanish couldn't comprehend it. To them, this was mutilation. Self-hatred made ritual. But the priests understood it differently. Pain was not punishment. Pain was currency. Blood was not waste. Blood was prayer. And the sexual organs, the sites of pleasure, of creation, of the deepest vulnerability, these were where the prayer became most powerful. Imagine believing that the sun would not rise unless you bled, that the earth would crack and swallow your family unless you pierced yourself in the place where life begins. Imagine waking every morning knowing that your survival, and the survival of everyone you loved, depended on your willingness to wound the most tender parts of yourself. This wasn't cruelty. This was devotion. But it was also agony. And when the Spanish arrived, men in iron, carrying crosses like swords. They looked at this agony and saw only darkness. They didn't ask why. They didn't try to understand. They simply decided it must end. Tlatelolco. The plaza is full of smoke. Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, first bishop of Mexico, soldier of God, instrument of salvation, stands before Paya. It's taller than a man, wider than a house, and it's made entirely of books. Not books as the Spanish understand them. These are codices, folded bark paper painted with glyphs that hold centuries of knowledge. Astronomy, medicine, history, and yes, sexuality, fertility rites, ritual instructions, the sacred logic that made everything we've just seen make sense in its own terms. Zumarraga gives the order. They light the fire. Thousands of codices burn. The smoke rises black and thick, carrying with it the cosmology of an entire civilization. The priests who spent lifetimes learning to read those glyphs stand in the crowd, silent. Some are weeping. Others have faces like stone. The Spanish friars watch with satisfaction. They've seen what's in those books. The images of God's coupling, of priests bleeding themselves, of ceremonies they can only call demonic. To them, this isn't knowledge. It's infection, a disease of the soul that must be cauterized before it spreads. The word they use is sodomy. It becomes a weapon, a justification. The Aztecs practice sodomy. Their write-in reports back to Spain. They are sodomites, demon worshippers, practitioners of unnatural vice. And therefore, the conquest is not cruelty. It's mercy. It's salvation delivered by sword and fire. But what the Spanish called sodomy was often simply difference. A worldview where bodies weren't shameful, where sexuality wasn't sin, where the flesh could be sacred without being pure. The friars couldn't see that, or wouldn't. They projected their own anxieties, Europe's festering sexual guilt, its obsession with chastity and damnation, onto a culture that had never known those categories. And so they burned it, almost all of it. Only fragments survived. The Codex Borgia, hidden by a sympathetic priest. The Codex Mendoza, sent to Spain as evidence of conquest. Sahagun's documentation, written with a scholar's care and a Christian's horror. That's what we're left with. Not the Aztec understanding of sexuality. Not their words, their logic, their reasons. Just the conqueror's disgusted whispers. Just the ashes. An entire civilization's knowledge of the sacred body, deliberately erased, burned, made silent. And now, 500 years later, we stand in that void, trying to reconstruct what was lost, trying to hear through the smoke. But the reconstruction itself is contested, painful, because every attempt to understand is filtered through the same colonial lens that destroyed the evidence in the first place. Today, archaeologists dig into the ruins of Templo Mayor. They find offerings buried in the sacred precincts, shells arranged in patterns that symbolize fertility, ceramic phalli, smooth and worn, bone rasps, instruments for drawing blood from flesh, still sharp after 5 centuries in the earth. But objects don't explain meaning. A shell is just a shell until someone tells you it represents the womb of the earth goddess. A ceramic phallus is just clay until someone explains it was an offering to ensure the rain would fall. And a bone rasp, without the prayers that accompanied its use, without the cosmology that made the pain sacred, is just a tool for self-mutilation. We're left interpreting fragments, guessing at rituals through broken pottery and Spanish translations of Nahuatl words that had no European equivalent. And every interpretation is filtered through bias. Ours. Theirs. The weight of 500 years of colonial narrative pressing down on every conclusion we draw. Some historians, scholars like Louise Burkhardt and Camilla Townsend, argue that certain sexual rituals described by Spanish chroniclers were fabrications, propaganda designed to justify genocide. They point to inconsistencies in the colonial accounts, to the way descriptions of Aztec perversion conveniently escalated the closer Spain came to needing moral cover for mass violence. They might be right, but others insist the evidence is too consistent across too many sources to dismiss entirely. Sahagun, Duran, the indigenous informants who contributed to the Florentine Codex, the glyphs in the surviving codices, the archaeological record itself. They might be right too. The truth is, we don't know. Not fully. Not with certainty. When a culture is erased, what's left isn't history. It's archaeology. And archaeology is interpretation. It's educated guessing. It's the living projecting meaning onto the dead. So we must ask ourselves, are we recovering truth, or are we building new fantasies? Are we honoring the Mexica, or are we using their ruins to tell ourselves stories about the exotic, the forbidden, the darkly sacred? Even now, even with good intentions, with scholarly rigor, with respect, we might be doing what the Spanish did. Seeing what we want to see. Projecting our own obsessions onto a civilization that can no longer correct us. That's the horror of erasure. It's not just that the truth is lost. It's that the silence can be filled with anything. And the Mexica, the people who lived and loved and believed and bled, they can't speak back. But their descendants can. But the Mexica are not silent. Their descendants are still here. In Mexico City, in Puebla, in villages scattered across the Central Highlands. Speaking Nahuatl, remembering, refusing to let their ancestors be defined by the men who tried to destroy them. Today, indigenous scholars and spiritual practitioners are reclaiming pre-Columbian sexuality, not from Spanish condemnation alone, but from Western romanticization too. They are rejecting both the friars' horror and the New Age fantasy. Both are forms of erasure. Both replace Nahua truth with someone else's story. Scholars like Jose Watson Delgado and practitioners within contemporary Mexica spiritual communities argue that their ancestors' understanding of sexuality wasn't primitive. It wasn't perverse. It was an expression of a radically different ontology, a way of being in the world where the sacred and the erotic were never separated in the first place. They point to something the colonizers could never grasp, that for the Mexica, divinity wasn't elsewhere. It wasn't locked in heaven, distant and pure. It was here, in blood, in breath, in the heat between bodies, in the moment of creation and the moment of death. There's anger in this reclamation. Centuries of anger. At the burning of the codices. At the missionaries who called their ancestors demons. At the anthropologists who turned their rituals into curiosities. At the New Age seekers who cherry-pick symbols without understanding cosmology. But there's also pride, resilience, a refusal to be ashamed of what their ancestors believed. They are not asking for permission to tell their own history. They are demanding that the world stop interpreting it through colonial lenses. Stop filtering 500-year-old practices through Christian guilt or modern morality or academic detachment. Listen, they say. Don't project. Don't sanitize. Don't simplify. Their ancestors weren't monsters. But they weren't saints either. They were people who believed the world would end if they didn't act. Who saw the body as a site of divine responsibility. Who understood that creation and destruction were not opposites, but partners in the same cosmic dance. And that knowledge, that radically embodied theology, was stolen, burned, buried under cathedrals built from temple stones. But it's not gone. It's in the language still spoken, in the ceremonies still practiced, quietly, away from tourist eyes, in the collective memory of a people who survived 500 years of being told their ancestors were savages. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about survival, about identity, about the ongoing violence of historical erasure and the fierce work of cultural resurrection. And it forces us to ask, what does this forgotten history mean for the rest of us? Why does this history disturb us so deeply? Not because the Aztecs were more violent than the Europeans who conquered them. At the exact same moment the Mexico were offering hearts to the sun, the Spanish Inquisition was burning people alive in public squares, torturing confessions from heretics, pulling bodies apart on the rack in the name of a God who preached love. The difference wasn't the violence. The difference was where they put it. The Aztecs made their violence sacred, public, visible. They climbed the pyramid steps in daylight and opened chests beneath the open sky. They didn't hide what they believed the cosmos required. They didn't privatize their terror or dress it in bureaucratic language. And they didn't separate sexuality from the sacred. Didn't lock desire behind closed doors and call it sin. Didn't build an entire theology around the idea that the body is fallen, shameful, a prison for the soul. That's what we can't forgive them for. Not the blood. We've spilled oceans of it. Not the sacrifice. Every civilization builds itself on bones. No, we can't forgive them for refusing the lie we've been taught since childhood, that flesh and spirit are enemies, that the erotic and the holy occupy different worlds, that transcendence requires the denial of the body, not its embrace. The Aztecs held up a mirror, and in that mirror, we see that the boundaries between sacred and profane, between violence and love, between the erotic and the divine, these aren't universal truths. They are cultural constructs, stories we tell ourselves to make sense of existence. And the conquistadors couldn't tolerate that mirror, so they smashed it, burned the codices, built cathedrals on top of temples, buried the cosmology that said flesh itself was divine, that blood was prayer, that the body in all its vulnerability and power was the site where the universe renewed itself. 500 years later, we're still terrified of that idea. We're still trying to keep the body separate from meaning, still treating desire as something to be managed, controlled, confessed, pathologized, still telling ourselves that transcendence happens elsewhere, in churches, in meditation apps, in anything but the messy, bleeding, sexual, mortal fact of being embodied. The Aztecs believed different, and for that belief, an entire worldview was erased. Somewhere beneath Mexico City, buried under centuries of colonial architecture, the ruins of Templo Mayor still exist. Archaeologists walk through the foundations. Tourists take photos. The stones remember what happened there. The gods, perhaps, are still hungry. And we, standing here in the present, safe in our certainties about civilization and progress and moral superiority, we tell ourselves we're different, that we would never climb those steps, that we would never believe something so deeply it would cost us everything, that we've evolved past the need for blood and ritual and the terrible intimacy between the sacred and the flesh. But have we? Or did we just learn to hide it better?